Today, I have the pleasure of introducing you to one of my best friends, Elyssa Smith. She's an amazing coach. She's somebody that you really need to have on your radar. And I can't wait to dive into your story, Elyssa, today. Elyssa, thank you so much for being
Oh
here.
my goodness, I'm so excited. We've been waiting for this. It's so much fun.
I know, I can't wait. So, why don't you tell everybody what it is that you do right now and who you serve right now?
I'm a trauma-informed life strategist. And what that means is that I help women who are struggling and feeling like they're getting in their own way with self-sabotage, procrastination, people-pleasing, anything like that. I help them to uncover any trauma roots that those behaviors have so that they can then heal and get rid of those behaviors for good.
Yeah, and you and I have talked about this a lot, and I'm so glad that everybody who's listening is gonna get to hear this. But we're gonna dive in a little bit into what is trauma, right? Because there's half of the population listening is probably afraid that they're going to be re-traumatized if we start talking about trauma, and the other half of the population feels like this doesn't apply to them because they don't feel like they've had any significant trauma. So we're gonna dive into exactly what that means and see how your strategies can help everybody. But what I like to do is I like to go back to the beginning. So I want you to tell everybody, where were you born and what was little childhood Elyssa like?
Little Alyssa was born in Muncie, Indiana, in the middle of a bunch of cornfields. I was born in a hospital. I'll just clarify. I wasn't born in a cornfield, but I was born in a hospital and went home to, the farm in the cornfields. And I grew up on a what used to be a dairy farm. And we did not have cows, we had cats. We
Cats.
rescued it became a dumping ground. We lived right by this, and my parents still live there, right by this bridge, and it became a dumping ground, or it was a dumping ground when we moved there when I was little, for just boxes of kittens and puppies. And so we actually ran almost our own little rescue, and in between, like, trouncing around and frolicking in the meadows and playing, Native Americans with my mom. We were all Native American princesses, and we would hike through the woods and forage for food and different stuff. It was just so much fun. We would also rescue these little animals. So I grew up just surrounded by all these little kittens and puppies and placing them, giving them homes, and that's what my life was like.
Did you have any siblings growing up? I'm like,
Yes.
I'm like, I didn't have pets, but I had sisters.
That's kind of
Did
the
you
same thing.
did you have any siblings?
Yes, I have a younger brother and a younger sister. So I'm the oldest. I'm the hero. I'm the fixer of the family. And so I grew up with the dynamic of having a younger sister 2 years younger than me, which we did not get along until we became adults. And
Mhm.
like when we both were pregnant with our sons 8 years ago, that's when we really started our friendship, and now we're like the best of friends.
Oh,
And I have
wow.
a younger brother who's 6 years younger, and he talk about growing up with the puppies and the kittens. So I was 8 when we lived on this farm for the first time, and he was 2. So we would just find him outside underneath a pile of puppies sometimes. He was just wandering little tiny toddler, grass hanging out of his mouth, carrying his tiny plastic hammer or whatever, and then just sitting in piles of puppies.
What did your parents do for a living?
So my parents are both in academia. My mom was a French professor and then a French teacher at the high school level. She's now a therapist. My dad was an architecture professor, landscape architecture, and now he's the dean of a college at a university.
I'd love to know, you said that you had kind of like a tough relationship with your sister and now you're good friends, but like, do you, when you look back at your childhood, what are the things that stand out the most in terms of your relationship with your parents, relationship with your family? Like, take me back to what that felt like.
Yeah, so for me, I thought I had the perfect childhood, and I think many of us do, right? We think, "Wow, this is really a wonderful way to grow up," and everyone probably deals with these same struggles that I deal with, so it's probably not really a big deal, not really that bad. So at the time, I just knew that I felt I mean, I just what I knew, and I mean, I felt this way, and this wasn't really the case, but what I knew is that it was my job to kind of keep everyone happy. And
Okay.
so I had this little job in my family of origin where I was the pleaser. I was the one who needed to get the straight A's. I needed to get the reward. I needed to get the awards at school, be high performing, high achieving. and my sister took on a different role, sort of an opposite role, and my brother took on a different role. And so it was like the three of us sort of had our jobs in the family. And each of us was, I mean, I think any family dysfunction, you end up realizing that you were hurting back then, but I didn't know that this was actually painful for me at the time.
Is there a particular memory that comes up from that time that you feel like is salient, that you think about often, that has formed you in some way?
I remember when I got my first B in like middle school instead of an A, and it was like this travesty to me. And the weird thing was for me, my parents didn't really mind. They didn't really say anything to me. But I got the impression that, wow, I thought I was perfect. I thought I was supposed to be perfect. I thought I had this down. What's wrong with me? And so this feeling of me being a problem started to develop around that time for me.
Where do you think that pressure was coming from, if not from your parents?
They never said anything but to me about, I mean, they loved us pretty unconditionally and also held themselves to impossible standards. And so I saw an example of no grace towards yourself.
Yeah. So let's fast forward a little bit through what was high school like? Were you still like the studious kind, or were things started to get complicated? What was high school years like?
Oh boy. So that I was constantly bullied throughout school, especially once we moved to the area where the farm was when I was 8. And so
Mhm.
it got more intense in high school, and it just spurred my perfectionism on even a little bit more. And so the way I experienced high school was what I had been like before, where I was shocked to get a B, but like on steroids. I needed to perform more. I needed to work harder. I needed to push through. And so when I experienced things like bullying, I really downplayed it. It was like, okay, wow, that's really painful, but that's probably what everyone deals with. And I did see other people dealing with. I saw other people who had it a lot worse than I did. And so it was really hard to acknowledge the hardship for me. And I just very much continued to internalize I must be the problem and I've got
Mhm.
to get out from under all this pressure, but I can't show anyone that I'm about to crack.
What were they bullying you about? Do you remember rationalizing?
Yeah, so in my town, socioeconomic status was a big deal, and my family came from a much lower socioeconomic status at that time, and the brand names of clothing were something I got bullied about in elementary school. I got bullied for my style being too like, this was the '90s, and I got bullied for looking like I was from the '80s. Um I look back at it and it doesn't hurt anymore and I laugh at it now, but at the time it was like, "Oh, I need to change." Anything I got bullied about, I need to change that about myself. I need to not be a target anymore. I need to change.
So when you get to college, you start creating your major. This was your path. What was that like, and when did things start to change?
I completely lost myself my freshman year. I did not have any idea who I was because all of a sudden there was no micromanaging guidance over my shoulder from a slew of teachers who were watching my every move. I didn't have a roommate freshman year. I had wanted one, but I actually got placed in a dorm where we lived in suites and I had my own room.
Mhm.
So I basically stayed in this isolation that whole year and could not find my tribe, couldn't find my people, my parents, and they've they've since actually apologized to me about this. But they just
Um,
assumed that once you get to be 18, you just like go off to college and you're fine and you figured it out. But I remember having so many problems and really being hard on myself about it. Not I look back and I realized I had no reason to know how to balance a checkbook. I had never done it before. No wonder I overdrafted my account. But at the time it was like, wow, I am a flawed human being. I can't believe I just went negative in my checking account and having to buy my own groceries and not knowing exactly even little things that seem little, like how to have a balanced diet. I had just always had someone telling me what to do, and then nobody was. So I didn't know how to have healthy sleep patterns. I didn't know how to have healthy eating. And so I had to go on this journey. It was like, wow, forget the fancy major. I just need to survive. So I went back to that real survival place and didn't end up changing my major until a little while later, but actually it was really important and amazing that I did.
Yeah. I'm starting to wonder. So you deal with people who have gone through trauma. And I think this is a really good point for us to kind of explain what that is.
Yeah.
Because this is kind of where you start to really discover that there's some trauma here to heal. There's some trauma that is starting to develop. There's some trauma that is going to happen, a little later in your life. And I want everybody to kind of understand when we talk about trauma, what are we talking about? Can you shed a little bit of light on that?
I'm happy to. I wish it hadn't taken me so long to figure this out because I could have had such a gentler experience for the last 15 years. There are three types of trauma. And when you think of trauma, most of us, and this was true for me until several years ago when I started studying it, most people think of big stuff, violence, war, being a soldier, a big disaster, losing a loved one in a tragic way. Those are considered trauma. And that's pretty widely accepted as trauma, which is why most of us, including me, brushed off, oh no, I've never been through trauma because none of that had ever happened to me.
Mm.
It turns out there are two other types of trauma that could be affecting you if you're dealing with any of the symptoms that I was, which are little t trauma. And little t trauma is ongoing trauma, typically, or something big that happens that is nonviolent that still cause a great disturbance emotionally. So that would be bullying. That would be facing massive rejection by a friend group. That would be the loss of a pet, things like that. And then the thing that I've started to study most recently, and this is where I specialize now, is tiny t trauma. Tiny t trauma is what happens to the survival brain especially when you're a child, when you learn certain negative self beliefs as an antidote or a coping mechanism to difficult things that are happening, such as me seeing that my parents never slowed down to take a break. I experienced that as a tiny t trauma because my brain then learned if we take a break when there's more work to do, we should feel ashamed and get back to work. So
Mhm.
those are the three types, and most of us have experienced one, if not more, of those.
Yeah. At this point, you're not necessarily aware of trauma being a thing, right? You're just trying to survive in your life, right? Just like everybody else is. And I'm really curious because we're going to start to fast forward a little bit through, the tumultuous 20s, right? But I want to start to get a feeling for when do you start to become more self-aware about this, right? Well, tell me, where did you go after college and how did you start to become a little bit more like, maybe I am responding to things that shouldn't be there, that don't belong to me, that don't belong in my head. I'd love to know what that transition to clueless and going through life like everybody else trying to survive to maybe this is something I need to take a closer look at.
After college, I became very depressed because at least at college, I had had a purpose. I had goals, I had grades to get, I had work to do. I was an RA, I did all these things, and I worked around the clock. That was familiar to me. When I left school and didn't have homework, didn't have deadlines, and I was working part-time, working retail, potentially going in a new direction with my career and all this different stuff, I again went through a period of time where I lost myself and I became suicidal after graduation because I really could not figure out who I was, what I was supposed to do. I remember literally calling my mom on the phone and being like, what do people do when they have a day off? I have never experienced this phenomenon.
Right.
I don't know what to do. I had two majors, I had two jobs. I don't know what I'm doing when I just have a job and no school. And, she suggested, well, you can go to the library. Like some people go on a walk. And I was like, I don't understand. So one of my very first therapy sessions, because once it became very serious and I actually was heading down that suicidality path. Uh, Thankfully, my family knew about therapy, and so they drove me to a therapy session. My mom did, and the therapist kind of started asking me, without my mom there, what was it like when people in your family experienced anger? And I just said, "Oh, we never were angry," thinking in my head, anger is a bad thing. And
Mm.
so we were never angry. And she said, well, anger is actually one of the really significant, important, and pivotal human emotions that we all experience. And I was like, I don't think so. And so then we started to unravel like, oh, these are more tiny T traumas I see now. Looking back in my family,
Yeah. I want to start, and you can pause me whenever you want, because I know that this we're gonna start to get into a little bit of heavier stuff that I want people to start to realize, that yes, it's we need to deal with the trauma that has happened, that we haven't internalized, that we haven't really rationalized yet, that is not really in the forefront of our consciousness yet. But then things started to get pretty heavy for you.
Mhm.
Can you tell us a little bit about, and whatever you're comfortable sharing, about your, like, how you met your husband?
Yeah, so I'm happy to share, and me telling my story has helped a lot of women, so I'm happy to do that here. I married my high school sweetheart, and we had been through some very tumultuous times in that high school era, and uh, then had kind of broken up for a while, and then got back together. What I didn't know, and what he was unaware of, is that he had an addiction, and so we struggled the first few years of marriage. I knew something was off. Things changed when we got married. And so I started really just trying to be the wife that I thought he wanted, and started to lose myself again, which is this theme that keeps coming up throughout my life, and always did until I started to really heal. That at the first sign of conflict, I become a chameleon. And I really get to that place where it doesn't matter what I want. Let's just not have conflict in the household. And so we went a few years like that, both of us in recovery from his addiction. There was betrayal involved on his part. And I did not know that I was continually being traumatized by this relationship.
What were some signs that if anybody is in a similar situation, they could be watching out for?
Sure. One of the biggest signs is if I would say what was hurting in the relationship, what wasn't working well for me, I would either be told back by him that that wasn't happening, that my concern wasn't valid, that I was expecting perfection from him, and essentially that I had no right to ask for any change because I was the one causing the problems in the first place. And so this message, covert, overt, it happened both ways, was really a part of my existence for a really, really long time. And it had started in childhood when I really did start believing I'm the problem. And so then I married someone whose addiction then said, yes, you are.
I can't even imagine getting to where you were at that point, already having worked with therapists, already trying to dig yourself out, and all of a sudden finding yourself in this situation. I would love to know, how did you handle that situation at a time? And what do you feel was the release valve that made you think, wait a minute, maybe I don't have to internalize that narrative. Maybe I don't have to own what he's telling me.
It took a long time for me. And a lot of the women that I help, I'm helping them get to a place where they understand that the way they're sabotaging themselves isn't just them, right? Had I had someone sooner that was telling me that, I think I would have been able to find that release valve a little bit sooner. But for me, it took almost a decade of existing this way. And it finally just I had to hit a rock bottom. For me, the rock bottom happened after I had a very traumatic birth of my son, who thank God we are now both fine and doing very, very well. He's 8 now.
Mm.
But at the time, we both barely survived the birth, and the medical complications, thank God he was okay, but my body was not. And on the heels of that birth trauma and the betrayal trauma and the emotional abuse and financial abuse that was happening in the marriage, we moved across the country to New York City. And I had physical ailments that caused it to be really hard for me to even navigate the subways. My knees would swell up the size of cantaloupes, and was carrying a baby on my back and my baby was colicky. He wasn't sleeping. And then I had a spouse who was really struggled to give any help at all in any way. And so it had to be, I think, the thing is, I'm grateful for this time period of my life because I think had it not all gone down so badly and so hard, I may never have reached the end of my coping. And so I even just was saying this week, I am so grateful for that time period of my life because I realized I literally couldn't go on like this anymore. Had I not had all those areas collapse all around the same time and the marriage be getting worse on top of it all, I don't know that I would have ever realized I needed to go back and get myself. But at this point, I see that that was my decision that I made at that point.
Do you have a memory that stands out of the time when you said, like, no?
Yes. I was on the phone with my mom and I was very distanced from my family at this point. That's kind of how it works when you're in a relationship like this. You kind of get isolated and you don't fight it. I mean, my job was to be a good wife and keep the marriage together. That's what I thought. So I was distanced from my family. I was on the phone with my mom one day and she had gently suggested a couple of times that perhaps the pain that I was in was not deserved. And so at this
That's new. That's new information. Like, no, whoa, that's new. What did that feel like?
so much relief.
What did you do next? What did you immediately get it? And you're like, oh, wait, she might be right? Or what happened after she told you that?
She had suggested it a couple times, but then something had happened where there was another betrayal with my husband where I remember asking her, "This is another betrayal, right?" Even though he's saying he's in recovery and he's saying this and saying that. And she said, "I think so." And it was like, I just asked her, I said, "Is it okay to leave?" And she said, "You have to do what you need to do. And you have permission to do what's right for you." And so I realized at that moment that if that was the case, if I didn't deserve all this, if I wasn't the problem, that I needed to put a stop to this once and for all. And I had asked and I had really gone after this. Like I had written him letters, I had written him emails, I had had conversations. We had had so much therapy, so much therapy. And so at this point, it was like, wow, maybe I don't deserve this pain. Maybe I could have a break. I just thought in my mind, it's like I could have a break.
So at this point, you've already had so much therapy, so many conversations, so much, like, let's trying to fix it. How did you ultimately decide to leave, and how did that go?
So it was really painful, obviously, anytime you make a life decision like that. But once I had made the decision, as sort of scary and sad, I was just crying the whole time. As scary and sad as it was for me. And, um, I packed up my toddler and my little dog and we got on a plane back to Indiana and came back to my family.
Did you tell him that you were doing this? Was there a conversation? How did that go? I'm imagining somebody listening who may be in that situation and they would have no idea how to go about it.
Yeah.
How did it go for you? Did you have a conversation first? Did they end up trying to get you to stay? What happened before you got on that plane?
I would never recommend going through this unless you have professional assistance. Absolutely. Don't do this on your own. I had professionals that were helping me, that were supporting me, that were giving me scripts, that were giving the just the exact targeted support that I needed. And I also had the advantage that he was out of town. The final betrayal had happened when we were traveling. And so I came back home early and I was able to and then I had sent him a letter. I said, "I need you to know, going back to be with my family for a while. I don't know how long it's going to be. And here are the ways I tried to tell you. And this is how you didn't listen. And I'm going to go get help and healing."
Wow. Thank you for mentioning about getting professional help. That is so important. Oh, that is so important. And I'm so sorry that you had to go through that. Um, what happened after? Did he try to get you to come back? Were there false starts, or was it like clean cut? I am done. You stay over there. I stay over here. We're gonna act like this is the new life. What was that moment like?
Yeah. So after that, I mean, absolutely he wanted me to come back. He wanted to show that he was going to do anything it took to be together. But where it really counted, he couldn't see what I needed and he couldn't give what I needed. And I kept writing it to him and explaining it. And eventually I just had to get really distant because every time I would interact with him, my body had a trauma response. And it made it really hard for me to think clearly.
Can we talk a little bit about your coaching? When did you make the decision in reference to where we are now in your story? At which point had you decided maybe I can become a coach and work through a certification? And like, how did that idea even come about?
So it was before all of this because I became certified while I was pregnant with my son and started to just get some word of mouth referrals for my coaching at that point. And so I just wanted to help women to be less stressed. I didn't know a lot about trauma when I first started out. And that I was already kind of doing that by the time I came back to be with my family.
When did the trauma part start to seep into the coaching that you were doing?
Around the time that I came back to Indiana, I was getting some training to help women who had been through similar things to what I had been through. And I started learning about this concept of betrayal trauma. And then I started understanding more about just how the brain works with trauma in general. And I realized that almost every single client that I was working with, all the women that I had been with, regardless of if they had had betrayal trauma, had dealt with some type of trauma brain experience where you have symptoms having been through trauma and your brain still feels unsafe. So I was able to take a lot of the concepts I was learning and start applying them. So that was about 6.5, 7 years ago.
And now, how far are we removed from when you got on that plane
Oh.
and fled that marriage and that situation? How many years have passed?
So 6.5 years or so, 6 years, 6.5.
And now, can you tell us a little bit of how you help women with this?
It's so good. My life is so good. My life is good. My clients are amazing. So I love to provide a gentle resting place for my clients because typically the women that work with me that want to come work together and tackle these self-sabotage things, they're really hard on themselves, just like I always had been. And so what we do is we start with what the obstacles are where you feel like you might be getting in your own way or where trauma some half my clients know that they've been through trauma and the other half come and say, I know I've got sabotage going on, I might have trauma. And so the ones that know they have trauma, I help them to really beef up their trauma healing. We create a lifestyle that serves them as they are really working through their trauma healing journey. And the ones that aren't sure if they've had trauma, I gently help them peel back the layers in a safe environment and get them surrounded and into trauma therapy if they need it. And we just work together. It's all about creating safety and empowerment.
Yeah. And for everybody who's listening, by the way, we're going to put the link to Elyssa's free Facebook group in the comments, in the show notes. It's the Stressless Lounge. Like not stressless, like stress less lounge. And that is, I have loved being a part of it because it's such a safe space. If you feel like there's no other place where you can have that kind of outlet where it's okay to talk about your big T and your little T and go and get support from this community and support from you, Elyssa, through your monthly trainings, through your just showing up live and giving people space. I really recommend it to everybody, especially if there's people in your life who don't understand. If you want to understand more about this, I'm gonna put the link down below so everybody can go and join it. And I have to say, like, just knowing you for the past few years, you have such a way about you. When I am with you, I feel immediately safe. And I feel like that's a quality that yes, you may have developed, but it's what makes you you. And I I I can't say enough good things about what the quality of human being that you are. I'm crying because I'm just a crier,
Oh, thank you.
um but like people are just so lucky to run into you, to run into your space, and I'm so happy to get to share you with everybody who's listening, because really we all have something to work on. Like absolutely all of us, whether it's a big T, little t, or a tiny t, and it shows up in our procrastination, and it shows up in our being late, and it shows up in all these other ways that we self-sabotage, and you have the answers to regulate that. So I wanted to say really thank you so much for sharing your full story with us. I know that it's not easy. This is not easy stuff to discuss. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think is the biggest misconception that people have of you as a successful businesswoman?
Okay, so you and I share this one, I think. People think I'm tall.
I know.
They'll see me on camera and they think I'm tall. I can't tell you how many times I get these guesses, 5'10", 5'8", whatever. I'm 5'1". I'm really a small person, and people are constantly shocked by that.
I remember before we met for the first time, I remember giving you that warning and
Yes.
telling you like, listen, just so that you're not shocked. Um,
And so you don't pat me on the head.
and so that please don't, you guys, PSA, never
Yes.
pat a grown ass woman on the head.
Yes.
You
Do
just don't
not.
do that. Do not touch a woman's head. Um,
Oh my
and
gosh.
so if everybody who's listening had to do one thing in the next 24 hours, what would that thing be?
I would want every single person, if you had to do what I'm telling you right now, to take a nice big deep breath, to remember that your self sabotage is not your fault. It's a result of things you went through, and there was no other way to come out of it. And to understand that if you're struggling to be productive right now, there's something about the task at hand that feels unsafe, and you can get to the bottom of that.
And everybody should go and follow you to figure out what that bottom is so we can dig
Yes.
ourselves out of it.
Go follow me.
So please tell us, where can people find you? We're definitely going to put the Stressless Lounge link in the show notes, but tell everybody where can they go and follow you and start to solve the self-sabotage situation.
Do this. Yes, let's all go together. You can follow me on Instagram at Your Best Moment Is Now.
And that link is going to be right below. Elyssa, I love you so much. I love you so much. I'm giving you a hug.
Big
I love
hug.
you so much. Thank you so much for doing this and for really being so open and generous with your story. I know that there's a lot of people out there who are going to really start to perk up and realize, you know what, maybe I can change things in my life. So really, thank you so much.
You're so welcome. It's so possible to feel really good every day.